Today in the EU, Net Zero Industry Act and the future of green industrial strategy. Countries in the Union generally agree that green technologies are a crucial piece of the puzzle to meet climate targets and stay competitive in the renewable energy market. They agree less on how to boost their competitiveness against ever-growing United States and China. Hello and welcome. I'm Giada Santana, and this is Today in the EU. I'm here in the studio with Donagh Cagney, editor of the Energy and Environment Hub at Euractiv, to talk about the Net Zero Industry Act and what's next for the energy industry.
On the Net Zero Industry Act, Provisional Agreement, Amendment 41 by roll call. Vote is open. Vote is closed. Adopted. First reading of
Donagh, the Net Zero Industry Act was voted 1 week ago. It was first presented by the European Commission in March. Why are we talking about it today?
Well, the vote was a week ago, but we're still talking about it today because it's really central to the election debates that we're having at the moment. We had the Maastricht debate of the lead candidates on Monday, and this issue of decarbonization, climate action, but also marrying it with economic growth was one of the central points of candidates, and in fact, an area where many of the candidates were in agreement.
Yes, exactly. On Monday night, 8 candidates from political parties across Europe took part in a televised debate in Maastricht. They had a wide-ranging discussion. What struck you about their conversation when it comes to energy policy?
Well, climate was one of the 3 topics on the agenda for the leaders. What struck me was that there was quite a large degree of consensus. Now, the discussion was very much at a high level, so political slogans, but there was this belief amongst most of the leaders that, yes, competitiveness and decarbonisation can go hand in hand. Ursula von der Leyen, as you might expect, was most articulate about that because she was defending her own record. She could speak with great fluidity about some of the files that she had delivered in the next couple of years and where she wanted to go in future years.
We designed the European Green Deal as our new growth strategy. Europe is a leader in clean technologies. With massive investment, we can show that there's progress.
But Bas Eickhout from the Green Party was probably the most passionate about the topic. You could see it really went to his heart.
So I think also a lot of the young voters here still demand this climate urgency. I mean, in 2019, it was Ursula von der Leyen saying, I'm going to do my man on the moon project. Just imagine that JFK after 4 years would have said, well, maybe halfway to the moon is okay as well. You know, when we are doing climate action and deliver on climate neutrality, we need to invest in a new economy. The Green Deal was a good start, but we are only at the beginning of this marathon.
The Net Zero Industry Act is but a part of that, and it's a stepping stone. There's going to be a lot more coming down.
Let's talk about the Net Zero Industry Act, also called NZIA, more in detail.
What it basically is a set of rules that are tried to encourage more manufacturing of critical green technologies in Europe on EU soil rather than importing it from China or elsewhere across the world.
You've been closely following the directive and the steps that it took to get to its approval. What are the elements that made it through Parliament negotiations?
Well, there's a few elements to the Net Zero Industry Act. One of the first things is that it comes up with a definitive list as to what is a net zero technology. Now, the obvious things are on there: wind, solar, batteries. But there's a few which wouldn't spring to mind automatically. For example, the enrichment of nuclear fuel, taking sewage gas to create energy, even wind sails for ships to enable them to sail more efficiently. A key element is a target. At least 40% of the EU's annual deployment needs for these technologies for decarbonisation should be manufactured in the EU. They're looking at permitting, so it's easier to set up factories. Larger factories, they need to get their permits, and this is a requirement on national governments. They need to get those permits within 18 months, so a year and a half, and for smaller projects within 1 year. There's a lot done in terms of public procurement as well, so how governments are purchasing these equipments, and also auctions for renewables, so deploying of wind and solar across the territories.
NZIA features new criteria for sustainability and resilience. How are these targets supposed to shape the industry?
The basic point here is to get away from pure price competition. Perhaps European manufacturers won't always have an edge. So it introduces requirements for member states when they're doing auctions for renewables to put in non-price criteria, for example, the wider environmental sustainability, resilience as well. If too much of your technology, of a country's technology is coming from one country, that gives you a reason for governments to procure it from other suppliers. Cybersecurity is a big one as well. And quite honestly, they're thinking about China from that respect. Also, if there's a high degree of innovation, European manufacturers can cite these things and use that to help compete and help to win auctions.
Who supported it and who was against it when it came to the vote?
The vote was quite positive towards the Net Zero Industry Act. It passed quite easily. There were 361 votes in favour, only 121 against. It's not a highly political issue, as in most mainstream parties understand the need to decarbonise and can understand the logic of why Europe should be prosperous in doing that. The divide will probably more so be in the Council between the different member states. And that talks a little bit to some of the points we were discussing earlier, which is that some countries are not big believers in industrial strategy. Some countries don't have green industries. And some countries inherently, ideologically, you might say, are very suspicious of a bigger EU with a bigger budget, with things like resource transfers between countries or even common EU debt.
Some critics say that the Net Zero Industry Act costs nothing and will achieve nothing. What do you think?
The critics are correct, quite simply. When this proposal first came out, it was at a time of crisis. Not only had we been in a situation where Russia had closed off the gas taps and creating a huge amount of economic crisis, but we were also in a context where the US administration had come out with its Inflation Reduction Act, which is an extremely ambitious package of measures, primarily tax credits, that will pay manufacturers to manufacture things like wind turbines, batteries, electric vehicles, solar panels on US soil. And Europe had been talking for a long time about a Green Deal Industrial Act. This was an integral part of President von der Leyen's strategy right from the moment she took office. But we hadn't really been following up, and certainly not with the sort of cash that the Americans were putting on the table.
What was the original plan to finance the directive?
When the Net Zero Industry Act was initially proposed, there was also talk of a sovereignty fund accompanying it. This was an idea that you would back up that act with a lot of cash to support the companies to actually do come and stay in Europe and support those manufacturing jobs. That never happened.
How come?
The primary reason is that it touched upon some real fault lines within the EU about money, who pays for it, right? As soon as the proposal came out, some member states, including large member states like France, were very much in support of it. But it became quite clear that quite a few countries weren't so keen on this idea of industrial strategy and pushing money into green industries for manufacturing for a couple of reasons. Some of them don't have green industry, so they don't like the idea of paying for it. But many of them form a group known as the frugal countries, typically northern countries who run more balanced budgets, who are more suspicious of state spending, for example. And they particularly they like this idea because if there is a future sovereignty fund, then they'd have to pay for it. And they were skeptical about using the money in this way, and in particular, using their money in this way.
The competition with the United States has been quoted as one of the main factors to approve the Net Zero Industry Act. What is the United States doing that Europe will not be doing or is not doing at the moment?
In a word, tax credits. So essentially, they updated their laws to say that if you do build wind turbines or other green technologies like batteries in the US and it's based on US territory, you will get tax credits. So this is a reduction on future tax that you would pay. So we don't know how much it's going to amount to because it's on future tax credits. There are different estimates, but the boom in manufacturing that has resulted from the IRA, from the Inflation Reduction Acts, suggests that it'll certainly be in the multiple billions of dollars.
The European Union set specific deadlines to meet its climate targets. The most important ones are 2030 and 2050, which are not that far away. Are we on track?
We are broadly on track. There has been some advice to say that we can hit these targets, but there is more work needed to do. The European Commission at the moment is setting its 2040 targets as well. And there's general consensus it's probably going to be a 90% reduction on greenhouse gas emissions by 2040 relative to 1990. Now, the Commission's position is that with existing policies that have been put in place over the last couple of years, we can get to 88%. So there's only a little bit of additional policy work needed to get to 2%. And one of the big files that expected to deliver on this is the EU's emission trading scheme, which puts a price on carbon and forces industries to reduce their emissions. That sounds very optimistic. Some people are skeptical. Policies can change, particularly if there's a shift to the right and there's more hostility towards environmental laws and climate laws. A lot of these rules, they've been agreed at a European level, but they still need to be implemented. And we know that some countries in some circumstances can be quite late in implementing those strategies. A final point, which is very relevant to the Net Zero Industry Act, is many commentators say that there is, in fact, a trade-off between Europe meeting its decarbonisation goals and becoming an industrial power in green technologies. So, for example, if we really wanted to decarbonise, we should be deploying as much solar, let's say, as possible. And we want to do that as cheaply as possible as well, because these things do come at a cost. And there's lots of different costs coming as we decarbonise different parts of the economy. So some commentators would say is that by trying to have a European approach, we're going to raise costs, we're going to make it harder to reach those targets.
According to the latest polls, most European governments are shifting to the right. So when it comes to this trade-off between being competitive and being green, what do you think will come out of it?
We'll have to see what the elections produce, but what gives me some confidence that the EU will maintain its commitments on climate is that the political discussion has shifted on climate in the last number of years. Previously, this trade-off, as you say, between competitiveness and decarbonisation was seen as a trade-off, whereas now most parties, including those on the right, would say that the two go hand in hand, that to decarbonise we will become more efficient and we will become leaders in the technology of tomorrow. And in fact, when you look at China, that would indeed seem to be the case. China took seriously decarbonisation goals about 15 years ago, and they started thinking, what does that mean? And so they've been snapping up access to and refining of critical raw materials. They've been growing their lead in renewable and storage technologies as well. And they're in a very strong position relative to ourselves.
I'm Giada Santana, and this was Euractiv's Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever it is that you get your podcasts. Leave us a star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite streaming platform. It will really help us spread the word about our work. This episode was produced by Miriam Sanz de Tejada, Nicoletta Yonta, and me. See you tomorrow! As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.